Welcome. I thought that what we would do is we would start at the beginning, just talk about your childhood. And I'm particularly interested in why you chose the title, The Butler's Child.
The title on the South Carolina Press book, right?
Yes.
You know, the original book didn't have the subtitle. And when the South Carolina press publisher said, you know, we'll do the book, but The Butler's Child simply is not enough. And his folks read the book and said, how would you like this subtitle? And I said, it hits the nail on the head. And I like this much more than the original book.
And the people in the original book didn't think a subtitle was appropriate. It didn't come up.
It didn't come up.
Yeah.
It was a bigger commercial publisher. And part of it maybe was they were doing me a favor. I didn't know. You know, we're a academic publisher has a totally different purpose in doing what they're doing.
Yeah. So I really want to start out to just a few minutes about your childhood, and I'm interested in what it was about your childhood. Now you're looking back, that gave you the impetus or the inspiration to live the life that you've lived, committed to social justice?
You know, it didn't come early. I probably got the inspiration more when the civil rights movement started blossoming out in the 1950s. Until then, I lived what I would call, my brother called it a middle class life, a upper middle class life, approaching upper class, somewhere below it. And the somewhere below it was probably because the wealth of my family came from Albert Warner, who was one of the Warner brothers. And the Warner brother family were immigrants themselves. And that's kind of interesting, as I learned later on. They couldn't get in to the German Jewish elite clubs that existed in New York City at the time. So maybe I got a little insight into that dynamic. I don't know, but it protected me from being just another upper class brat. You know, it was probably a good thing. A major, he called himself major. They gave him an honorary major title in World War I because I think they made some films for the government. So they said, oh, you're a major. So he loved it. So he was a major.
Yeah.
And the man, the butler and the butler's child was William Rutherford. And we were living, when I was very little, in Hendersonville, North Carolina, which is near Asheville, right outside of Asheville, in the foothills or the lower mountains in the west part of North Carolina. And Bill was hired into the family to I don't know, do odd jobs and do whatever. And when the war broke out, he was drafted, put into the Sea Beach, shipped off. And I really don't remember my relationship with him prior to his coming back at the end of the war. My father said to him, look, if you want to come back at the end of the war, tell me, I'll put money away for you every week, which my father did do, so that when you came back, you would have some little pot of money to get yourself going. So we had moved to New York City by that time, and Bill Rutherford came to work for us, and my parents were products of their own time. They socialized a lot. They went out a lot. When they got older, they incessantly traveled. And Bill became sort of almost a substitute father. I had an older brother. We were 2 years apart. Usual sibling rivalry went about, and he was older than I was and would chase me around, and Bill kept order. And Bill and I became, we're now talking 1946. I must have been 9 years old. The war was over. And he and I just built up this relationship.
So he was like a surrogate father. Your parents were traveling.
They traveled a lot. My father was a very nice guy, but didn't like to work hard and whatever, and didn't like to parent hard. And my mother didn't like to mother hard. And so Bill played a heightened role in my family. And that went on for years, for many, many years through, I went to PS6 in Manhattan, I went to Riverdale, he was always there. And when I was 13, I got sent off to military school where my brother had not only had gone, but he was still there. I was 13 years old. They put me on a train. I got off in, I think, Plymouth, Indiana. Somehow a car, I guess, took me to Culver, fit me into a little uniform. I was a little kid. I was like a year ahead of myself. I was one of 6 or 7 Jews in the whole school. And the school was very academic, which was a good thing. It was also very military. It was both. It was the rare military school where they wanted the kids to really get a good education. My brother had done well in the school, and so in my competitive zeal, I decided I would do better than he did. If any of you are younger siblings, you might know that experience. The older kid tries to keep the younger kid down. The younger kid doesn't like that. And the way to show that at a military school was to say, okay, I'll do what they want. I'll be the good kid. I'll learn, and I'll play by their rules. So That went on here, excuse me 1 second. Oops. For many years, I did do well. By the time I was probably just in my 3rd year, junior, I became conscious in a thinking way that when we went to this huge mess hall at Culver had, beautiful mess hall, sat there. When you were a plebe, you sat like this and took care of the people on either side. That was the deal. By the time you were a junior, you were free to move around, especially if you had gotten a little rank, which I had. So started moving around and had a few very few friends, but a few friends, and they were the smart kids. And I had become very aware that we were waited on by Black kids. And brought us the food, took the food away, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and disappeared. They were gone. And Culver was in the wilderness, really. It was in farm country. There were woods about. And Culver must have had 1,500 acres that it either owned or controlled. It had some little airport. And so I started wondering, where were those kids? What happened to those kids when they weren't waiting on us? Where did they go to school? Did they go to school? And they had been shipped up from the South. These kids, they were all from Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia, whatever, but deep South. And even on weekends, if you had a pass and could walk into the little town of Culver, which had one theater, you never saw these kids, ever. And so I started thinking, what about them? What's their life? What are they learning? What's going to happen to them? We're being raised to go to elite colleges and whatever, and taught some kind of military code and all the rest of that. They wait on us and they're gone. And started talking to my friends about that. Where are they? Well, they're in a barracks somewhere in the woods out there. Have you ever seen it? No, we don't even know where it is. Have you ever talked to one of them? No. They have zero contact with us. And that stuck with me until this day. And by then I graduated Culver in 54.
But before you leave Culver, I know Kirk had a specific question about your experience at Culver.
Yeah, I was curious, and it's really interesting that you touch on that very point, because you made a point in the book that while this experience sparked certain questions, certain big questions,
Right.
they were never covered at that institution. And, in the modern day now, when we think about legal education, are those big questions covered? Do you think those big questions are even being covered or answered now in legal education?
Well, it's funny. Driving down here, I looked over a little sheet where I'd written a couple notes on the sheet. And one of them was rule of law. Rule of law. And last time I was down here, one of the last times, I was talking to the dean and said, a little bit hesitant because he's the dean of a law school. And yes, I'm a civil rights lawyer who's handled a lot of cases. But what is the rule of law? And I raised that question. I raised it a little bit hesitantly because I'm not a law professor and I don't teach law. And I've heard rule of law since I was in New York Law School. So what is it? And as a civil rights lawyer, what I was going to say keenly, I hate the word keenly, but I'll use it, keenly aware that the law in the civil rights field has changed. It changed with Brown versus Board from a racist Southern form of law the Supreme Court put its imprimatur on and did so both after the Civil War in I think 1876 and did so again right after Brown versus Board in 54. That gets me right back into 54. And by 55, it had written the second Brown decision that as a civil rights lawyer, I believe negated to a huge extent the Brown versus Board decision. Said, oh, well, you white folks have real tough times trying to figure out what to do about this, and it's terrible, and you need time. And that time kept stretching and stretching and stretching. And maybe I hadn't thought of that as a rule of law issue, but the more you work in the field, the more you see the law coming in 54, creating an opening, and then you see the Supreme Court closing that opening. And so I started at the NAACP and really as a volunteer in 63 on the staff and 64 of the staff of the General Counsel. And without thinking of the phrase, the rule of law, I saw it evaporating. And that led to 9 Men in Black who think white. And now today, it's not only the Supreme Court in its decisions today, for years, if you really look at it closely, it has negated civil rights progress. It has limited civil rights progress. It, like the court in 1876, created a high bar for civil rights cases in order to prevail. All of a sudden, you had to prove intent in a way which was extraordinarily difficult, which really started collapsing what real civil rights were all about. Why intent? People are either treated fairly equally, can move ahead or they can't. And why should you, with the Constitution, which talks about equal protection of the law, why should you be restricted? And you saw that restriction moving.
So within that context, what should we be teaching our students with regards to the rule of law within the context that you just mentioned?
You know, I'm not sure. What I think you should be doing, and what I thought the law school was doing when I was down here, I guess before COVID, with that week indoctrination session in which various faculty members, including you, were teaching the students that if you look at every area of American law, you'll see the impact of racism. And you'll see white superiority. And some of it's just so blatantly obvious. I mean, negligence law, where your recovery from injury depends on whether you're rich or poor, which very often translates into black or white, but it's bad for everyone. But there it is, built into the law. And so if your law students go out and become negligence lawyers, and the case comes to them, they'll start asking, who's my client? Is he a successful character? Does he make a lot of money? What are his damages going to be? And if he's a working class guy, there'll be something, but probably not enough to cover the losses if he had a serious injury. If he's started out a wealthy guy, here's a pile of money, I can buy a even bigger house, you know. So I'm not sure what the rule of law is. And I think it's used very often to cover the reality of the problems in our law. And rule of law, everyone behave, follow this. This is the way. And then you start thinking about it and you say to yourself, well, what's the alternative? Chaos? You know, what are you gonna, how do you create a rule of law for a country in which Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence set forth what freedom is really about? How do you do that? What is the rule of law? How do you create that?
Maybe the beginning or the first step is asking the question. Maybe the question that, asking the question is the answer, right? That's the nature of it.
Right, breaking it down. Breaking it down. Let people see what the problem is. I'm not an anarchist. I know without some very real substantial structure, you'll have what you see with the right wing in America right now, chaos. Election, it's a fraud. What's the evidence of the fraud? It's in my head. Who cares? So you need a structure. And I'm not a philosopher. I've been a lawyer working as a kind of foot soldier in the struggle to maybe develop little pieces of the law that people can use to create more equality. I don't know. I think it's for you guys. You academics have to help us out there. not only in law schools, but in universities, in ethics departments, certainly in philosophy departments, history departments. How do you make sense of this so that people can say, yeah, this is a good thing, this works well, we can use this to help everyone to create a better a better republic. But right now we're struggling with that, more than struggling at times. So I don't know. It's a long answer to it.
No, it's a good answer. It's a tough question, but it's a good answer. It's a good answer.
I'm going to pivot a little bit from this question.
Okay.
You talk a lot about your family in your book. So I had a question about that specifically. So for me as a reader, one of the very affecting parts of your book was how you kind of watched your relationship with Bill go from someone who felt like a parent to you to, as you got older, your relationship became more formal and more distant. And so, throughout the book, you lament in other scenarios where there's this divide between you and people who are helping you or something like that. So in light of that experience that you've had growing up, I was just wondering how that impacted the way you thought about raising your children and what they're exposed to and.
Well, I touch on that a little bit in The Butler's Child. I touch on it with Kitty and I disagreeing about how we should raise our children. And Kitty comes out of a cop's family. And so almost the opposite of mine, where she wasn't expected to get an education. She's a girl. She can maybe be a typist in some office. And so education to her, she's now got a doctorate, but education to her was critical. And she would, oh, well, you went to Harvard, Yeah, but I didn't learn much there. It doesn't matter, she would say. Doesn't matter. That's where you went. That's your background. You can't escape that. The two of us in the beginning struggled on that. The fact is, I've thought about this too. During the period when our children were little, I was working insane hours. I was traveling, I was handling major cases that were probably above my head, but given the small resources we had, who else was going to handle them? I handled them. And Kitty really spent much more time than I did trying to humanize little children, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do. And so our children did go to private school, and what she said was true. And I think about it today, by the way, what do parents do today? I did endless cases because I had the freedom to do endless cases because I had Kitty, who was always there, even though she ended up becoming a doctor in psychiatry, social, whatever, sociology, all the things that she studied to get her PhD. So I was given the freedom. She really took the humanism that's inside her, which probably came from her mother, who weirdly married a Jewish guy on what appeared to be a whim, but maybe was more, I don't know. And her mother was somebody who didn't like racism, and she imbued her daughter with that. And between her daughter and me, because I was not totally absent, I was there quite a bit. And when I was there, I was fairly pointed about what my views are. I mean, maybe it's in the book or not. At this point, I'm forgetting what's in the book. But I remember going through Harlem at one point with the kids in the car, and Harlem then was in terrible shape. It's not in such great shape now, but was in terrible shape. And you could see the kids playing on the streets when they were 13, and there could be garbage on the streets, and things didn't look good. And one of the kids was more than my two sons. It was friends that were with them at that time. And they were talking about the kids being lazy. So, and my kids remember this, and I get infuriated. I said, if you lived in those streets and had to survive those streets, you had to know 10 times more than you know going to some fancy ass private school that teaches you all this geometry or whatever it's teaching you. You have to learn how to live in a very harsh environment. And it's going to destroy some of them, sure, but some it won't destroy, you know. But looking at them, never say they're lazy. You can say a lot of other things if you want, but lazy. Living in that world, trying to figure out how to negotiate in that world, 10 times harder than your life. So our kids have come out pretty well, you know, considering they know my views about some of these schools. I try and spend time with my grandchildren and try and get them gently think about some of the same issues. It's hard because what happens basically to a lot of white people who start out with a fairly good heart, they or their children or their grandchildren get sucked back in. I mean, there's so much out there for them. There's cars and whatever, all the things that the kids have now. And it's difficult. How do you get them to focus on what life is like for people from either a different color or a different class or different sex or whatever? It's hard, you know. I don't know if that answers your question, but
thank you.
It's interesting because people have either written in reviews or sometimes sent me letters or whatever saying, well, you know, he comes from a upper class, from a very protected class. What right does he have to talk about this stuff.
And to that you say,
And I end up saying, you know, you need people from my class to somehow get enough education, enough experience in life that they're willing to break out of the mold that they should go to business school or an elite law school and go to work for the biggest law firms and do the biggest case, whatever. It's hard, you know. Everyone in their circle sort of kind of just molds you to go in that direction. It's not easy.
did you ever feel like it would be a good experience to kind of live somewhere that seemed less insulated than the way you grew up?
Not really, mainly because I've been working all the time. And generally, the work connects me at least. And I try and take some of it and get it out there so that they can at least hear my experience. And part of that is why I wrote the book Butler's Child. I wanted them to understand that even in some of my really difficult cases, what I really ended up thinking the most about was, oh my God, I'm here and people are demonstrating and the cops are beating on them. And I don't have much to do this weekend. I can go home and play with the kids on the beach in the Hamptons, you know. How do you deal with that? I don't know. But Sunday night I'm back on the plane or whatever, and I'm back where I was before, and I'm back in that world, you know. So New York is a great place to do that work. There are other people who will work with you. And I've been very, very fortunate all my life to have really fine people work with me on some of my big cases.
I think this is sort of in the same line as Carly's question, but you discuss a little bit how you had these big cases and then you were able to take these weekends away, but maybe when faced with these larger showings of privilege, such as maybe like moving into the very large home or the new apartment later on in your career, you kind of said, I'm a civil rights lawyer. I can't do that. I'm curious, what was the image that you were associating with a civil rights lawyer, and what was sort of maybe the correlation you saw between these more outward showings of privilege, such as the larger home or a larger apartment, in comparison to maybe some pastimes that you enjoyed, such as dinners or going to the opera, and how did those sort of balance for you?
Well, I mean, part of it is I'm relatively shy. And so the shyness shows up in certain ways. Generally, my friendship group has been small. I mean, I've got a son now, it's a great son, and he's a good thinker, but his personality is very different than mine. He can make friends in 10 seconds, and I can't do that. So I've limited, either consciously or subconsciously, my friendship group to people who are struggling either with the same ideas or doing similar type work than I do. And, you know, on some level that protects me. You know, and Kitty protects me all the time. You know? So you know, when people ask me, do I live a good life? I say, absolutely. You know. Would I want my life to be any different? No. But have I carefully, or not so carefully, arranged my life so that I can do the work that I do and see that I'm living on a totally different level than most of the people, virtually all the people that I'm trying to work things out or trying to help, and how they live. And yet say, okay, that's the way my life is worked out. I do good work. I try fairly hard to be helpful. What can I say? You know, I like the opera. You know. I think I ended either the South Carolina University Press or the earlier version, and maybe it's in both, but the end of it has Bob Carter saying, you know, enjoy your life. You know, you only have one life, enjoy it. And Carter worked 10 times harder than I did, you know, especially during the Jim Crow times when he could get killed going south, you know.
In fact, I want to pursue that. You mentioned friendship. And so I just want to pursue that because I know that Bob Carter was a very close and dear friend of yours and a comrade, as it were. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about him and his life.
It's amazing how things have worked out for me in certain ways. I mean, I graduated this law school. I say this without bragging, I was first in my class.
You can brag for being first into your class.
I was editor-in-chief of the Law Review. And no one from the administration say, hey, Louis, do you want us to help you get a job? Never heard that. And so I got a couple interviews, one with the U.S. Attorney's Office, one with a prosperous big negligence firm, one with a regular big firm. And instead of going in, you know, all covered up and, well, what is it you do? And what would I be doing? And none of those prospects gave me a look, you know. And at one point I was, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was invited to the law school, to the law review dinner, and gave a little talk at the end. And I said, oh, boy, was I lucky. I was so lucky. No one wanted to hire me, you know, and that was true. And I graduated, I think, in early June. By July, I said, I'm going to walk over to the NAACP, see if I can volunteer. And so I did that, and they had, at that point, there were 3 attorneys in the general counsel's office. Robert Carter, who only had won 21 cases in the United States Supreme Court. Barbara Morris, who was a black lawyer who was very good, but ended up doing mostly Southern, I shouldn't say, but Southern cases trying to keep our workers in the South alive. So she was often gone. And Barbara Morris, I'm blanking on her name, of course.
Was it Constance Baker Motley?
No, Motley worked for the Legal Defense.
Oh, the LDF, okay.
I worked for Carter, and Carter and Jack Greenberg really ran very different shops. I mean, Greenberg concentrated on the South, certainly after, well, both before and after Brown in 54, trying to work out school desegregation. And by the time I was a volunteer at the NACP in the national office, not in the Legal Defense Fund. And the reason why Carter was there is because, and it's in his book, A Matter of Law, he finally wrote something about it. He got passed over for Jack Greenberg.
Yes.
And
By Thurgood Marshall. By Thurgood Marshall.
By Thurgood Marshall, right? Who was great, wonderful lawyer, but he's a human being. He made some bad mistakes in his life, and that was one of them. And Carter, certainly by the time I had come to the office, had figured out that if you couldn't desegregate the North, forget the South. I mean, the North, the South is just going to copy what we've got up here. And the Jim Crow will be dead, but Jim Crow's surviving legacy will well be alive. And no one wanted to hear that. And later, of course, when I wrote in 1968, 9 Men in Black, Wilkins fires me because he was angry at Carter, probably for reasons that I was unaware of. Carter was building up his own coterie of people at the NAACP who were far, far more militant than Wilkins. Wilkins was afraid of that. And so it was easy to jump on me without ever asking Carter, hey, Donnie Black, it's a troublesome article, which of course, when you look at it today, it's not only not troublesome, it's basic.
Accurate, yeah.
It's basic.
Absolutely.
Wilkins knew how to play hardball. He was trying to get rid of Carter. Fired me without talking to Bob, and by that time, Bob and I were really bonded. I mean, that goes back to your question. How did we get bonded? I'm not sure.
But those years at the NAACP were the start.
Right, but we got bonded because, number one, the office desperately needed me. One of the things I turned over to the archive was I wrote the version that the archive has, a list of the cases that our office had. I think I saw it most recently, maybe a day or so before I turned it over. There were about 150, 160 cases in there. Some monsters, some individual cases about somebody who was getting screwed or faced some kind of criminal whatever. But you needed an office of 20, 25 people to handle what was in that memo. And Carter, for whatever reason, it could be from the Bill Rutherford experience, the Culver experience, all the experiences of my childhood. Once I went to work there, I said, this is where I want to be, and he saw it. And so Bob Carter's a very interesting man. And I ended up loving him. He came out of a poor, rural, Southern family, the last of 9 children. His mother brings the family up north. I think a few had died by then. She did white people's laundry in order to keep her family together. She was an amazing woman. And for whatever reason, Carter flourished and ended up going, it's a long story, but it's in pieces of it. It should be 10 times longer and in much more detail. His memoir is very thin. He wrote it way too late in his life, A Matter of Law. But somehow the chemistry between the two of us was amazing. He had the ability to look at whites and pick certain of them out. That's literally what he did. And treat them like they were real people. He was able to treat white folks as not real people. He had that anger from what his life had been like, how it had been treated so badly so many times. So we would go to restaurants sometimes, and a waiter would say something to him, which by that time I was fairly sophisticated at reading people in terms of their level of racism. And the waiter would be perfectly innocuous, and Bob would get offended, and you would see that anger coming out. And by the way, when I later in my life, if I had a friend like Derek Bell, Derek and a few of his friends, they were over that. They might say, they blow the person off, but they weren't about to carry on about the person. Bob would carry on. So
Yes.
So
he was human, as you said.
Right. So you've got a split in me and a split in him, and probably a split in everyone.
Yes.
And you could see it,
What memorable case? Mention one or two memorable cases that you did with Bob at the NAC.
Okay, well, my first big case, probably two, Cleveland school case and the Cincinnati
Case, yeah.
school case. Cleveland, I mean, you're talking 1964, and I'm not wet behind the ears. I'm grounded, you know, and so he had 20 things on his mind. A really terrible federal judge in Cincinnati had thrown out his class action school case, which under old standards should have won. I mean, the school board, the whites were fleeing to the suburbs. So in a lot of the Cleveland schools, there were empty seats. And meanwhile, the inner core Black kids were in schools that were falling apart.
Mhm.
And so when I started there, what was going on? School board would move a bunch of Black kids to one of these underutilized, basically white school. Maybe it had a couple Black kids in it, but if you went in, it was white school. And they went to separate classes, they had separate athletics, they had separate eating times, they had separate bathroom times. It's in Cleveland.
This is the 60s.
This is 64. But at that, it's funny. It's not funny, it's interesting, I suppose. But at that time, Carter had made up his mind that he was not interested in proving intentional segregation because if you did it, there were thousands of schools in America. You'd never get through all of them. You needed some system whereby, yeah, if you can prove that that school, those schools aren't providing an equal education to white schools, they're
Yes.
violating the Equal Protection Clause. Come on, you know, not a theory that you would have to teach for the whole semester. It was obvious. And the Supreme Court kept moving away. Every time it got a chance, it would figure out some way to say intent, and then increase the standard as to what intent was, how you had to prove it. Oh, you can't look at the past.
Yeah.
You gotta look right now. Well, the past tells you everything. That's why the past is important.
You know, it's interesting when we study civil rights cases and, you know, these seminal cases in law schools, quite often we don't kind of make clear to our students what you're discussing right now, the strategic aspect, right? It's almost never about one case. It's about a series of cases, or actually it's about a strategy that you develop first, and then identifying cases and then moving forward. My personal opinion, I always thought Charles Hamilton Houston was the master of that, and everybody kind of learned from that. But it's just very interesting to hear you talk about it in those terms, and I wonder sometimes if we should kind of teach the strategy that way, like think of it as strategy rather, and then what cases were identified, and then parceling out the individual cases.
Well, I mean, in the 60s, there was a series of cases about the scope of the 14th Amendment, and they arose in housing. Why I'm blocking the names, I block names of cases all the time. But all of a sudden, there was an intent standard that the Supreme Court built into those cases. And then that intent standard just kept rolling along, and you can trace it. You can trace it in bizarre ways. So, for example, probably in '67, most of the time I was in the North, in the Midwest. Sometimes I was in the South, but most of the time I was in the North. And I'll get back, by the way, to where did we build our relationship, Cleveland and Cincinnati. But I was in another one of those Indiana, one of those Ohio type cases. I think it was in Columbus. We were just trying to figure out if we could get a case up in one of the cities. And I read in the paper that the Supreme Court of Ohio, 7-0, of course, had ruled unconstitutional I forget the city, a city's housing discrimination act was unconstitutional because there hadn't been a second. They created a standard. Akron, I think is the town. Akron passed the civil rights housing law, but we're not giving it effect. We're going to strike it down because there had to be another one by the state of Ohio, which is another way of saying we're getting rid of it forever. Because Akron was a little bit more liberal, the state was certainly not up to passing a housing discrimination statute covering the whole state. So 7-0, unconstitutional. I read about it in the paper. By then, Bob and I are close. And I say to Bob, this case should go to the Supreme Court. And he looked at the case and they said, you're right. Why don't you prepare the papers? If the Supreme Court takes it, that will be your first Supreme Court case. 1967, I was 30 years old. It was like somebody had put stars on my shoulders. I was very happy about that. And so I wrote the papers, and Supreme Court took the case. It now wouldn't be argued, whatever. But by then it was 1968, and I got fired for 9 Men in Black, and Bob said, but you don't work for the NAACP any longer. I can't let you argue the case, but I'll take you to the Supreme Court argument. You'll sit next to me. So we did that with Thurgood Marshall, kind of glaring down at me because he didn't like the title by that time, 9 Men in Black, which wasn't my title. It was the New York Times' way of selling the article. It had nothing to do with me. I was shocked when I saw it. I said, I know one man who's not gonna like this title, and he didn't like it. Yeah. And so Bob argued the case, won it 6-3. What I think it was, 6-3. free. And then within maybe 2 years, there was another case out of California which worked its way up to the Supreme Court. I was long gone from the NAACP, and I don't know who handled that case, but it didn't matter. By then, the Supreme Court said, oh, God, the Akron case, the intent was clear. Look at it. They created for only housing discrimination a double standard. And so we struck that down. But here, how do we know it was racism? A referendum in some county in California, which was clearly as racist as the Akron case. But you couldn't put your finger on the intent. So the Supreme Court went the other way. You can see that in cases just going up the ladder. Now it just, I wrote 9 Men in Black, and everyone said, oh my God, the great Supreme Court, and he's blah, blah, blah. Compared to what the Supreme Court is doing now, 9 Men in Black was child's play.
And let me ask, I'm curious on that theme of comparing history, right? History to the present. And I was curious about, your involvement with Attica. I mean, it's 50 years ago, and such a controversy now when we look at what's going on with Rikers Island and the fact that, recently there was a decision as to whether or not a federal monitor would step in. Are you surprised that these issues are still going on with regards to our prison system, or have things?
No, it seems to me that certainly in this country, I'm not sure what it's like in all the European countries. I think maybe in Scandinavian countries it's somewhat different, maybe in other countries where they actually do try to make some effort at reforming the prisoners. American prisons are brutal, and every now and then I try and get some people interested in them who I know, and everyone will say the same thing. If there's one area that no one wants to touch, it's prisoners' rights.
Why do you think that is?
Because, in my view, in the major prison areas, a huge number of prisoners are either African American or brown. And so they're inferior people. And they're wild and they're crazy and they're gang ridden, and let them do whatever they want to each other. And that's the way prisons are. Every now and then, if you read the newspapers carefully, you'll find in some state that the prisons are either on a hunger strike, all over the country, every now and then, not all the time. About 3 years ago, I think they tried a massive one that lasted for a couple of years, a couple of months, where they tried to pull things together. And they just waited them out. They know enough now not to do another Attica. Maybe. I mean, who knows? Nelson Rockefeller became vice president after Attica, after he said, oh, I made a mistake, which I thought was sort of, it's kind of in the same class, his remark when he was up for his confirmation hearing. It's sort of the same thing as Trump saying, oh, there's good people and bad people, and good people there, and no. Same thing, I made a mistake. So all these people got shot down and dragged through the mud, and I was actually came back from Attica, and couldn't be in the book, but literally the night I got back, one of the big people who have show programs with different, for whatever reason, they invited me to attend, and I attended. Again, I'm blanking on the name of the person who was running his show. It was his show. And when he said to me, well, what do you think, Lewis? You're always Lewis unless you're Big Shot, and then you're Mr. So I was still Lewis. That was okay. And Lewis said, and the program was before it was clear that no prisoner had killed any of the guards. The guards were, their own guards were shot down by the firepower of the people who were retaking Attica. And I said, he didn't care about the white guards anymore than he cared about the black prisoners. Just shoot them all down. That's what's necessary for him to maintain his prerogatives. And he got rewarded with the vice presidency, one step away from being president. But I want to go back to your question, if I can, about our relationship. So Cleveland, terrible judge. There was both intent and impact and whatever. And Bob, at that point, I forget what he had to do. He said, here, Lewis, here's the file, threw the goddamn file at me. And said, Barbara Morris was in the office that period of time. Barbara's very smart, and she was doing a case in Massachusetts, in the town that Charcutia lives in. I'm blanking his name. Big Armenian city in the middle.
Who had lived there?
Huh?
Who do you say lived there? In the town where who had lived? She had lived.
My roommate from college.
Oh, okay.
That I'm blanking on its name
Yes.
right now. It's terrible. So Bob throws the file down, he goes off, and I write a draft brief. And I talked not only about his effect theory, but all the open racism that showed it was a race case.
Oh, yeah.
And submitted the draft to him. And he said, now Lewis, I'm pushing the effect theory because it's the only way we're blah, blah, blah. And Barbara was, our seats were close to each other. Barbara heard that, and Barbara said, I've got some thoughts about that, Bob. So Bob said, okay, let's have a meeting. The meeting was Bob, Barbara, and me. And for whatever reason, I always thought I could speak my mind. I've never been afraid of speaking my mind. And so I said, we'll lose this case without that. And Barbara of Springfield, Massachusetts was her case. And Barbara said, Lewis is right. We'll lose Springfield too without putting in, and they've done the same thing up there, you know. So Bob was a great man to work for. Bob said, okay. He said, the two of you can do it the way you want, but you've got to put my effect argument first. It's the critical argument, but you can put all your race stuff in as well. March out, two of us rewrite the brief, switch the arguments around, make them work out the way he wanted, send him another draft, and he says, okay, print it up. In those days, by the way, no computers, right? So to print up a Court of Appeals brief where you had to do, what was it, 7 copies to the court or whatever. If you made one mistake, it went through 7 copies. And so, you know, your last draft, oh my God, if it
wasn't perfect.
If it wasn't perfect, you were in big trouble. Yeah. Anyway, we submitted it. But there was another this was my first major case, probably my first case. And it's up in the 6th Circuit. And Bob is arguing it. And I researched the case, of course, New York Law School. Not Harvard, I missed the case. At New York Law School, you wouldn't miss the case. You'd catch the case. I missed the case. And so and it was a case, I'll never forget it. It was a case that set the standard for appeal on preliminary injunction. And what the Supreme Court had done is what it was doing on everything. It was making it more difficult to get up there. And so therefore, it had said, no, that's not the standard. The standard is blah, blah, blah. I had missed that. And it had been decided maybe in the last 6 months or 12 months, 3 months, who knows. It was tougher. Today, you just put it in the computer and it jumps up. Then you had to do all those little volumes and go through one. And so he's arguing it before these 3 judges. It was in the 6th Circuit, 2 were from Kentucky. And he's arguing the standard, and they ream for having the wrong case. And I'm sitting next to him. Very often I sat there, he looks down at me, and I could see him look down at me. I knew I was in trouble, you know. So at the end of the argument, he looks at me and he says, "Boy, never do that to me again." And I'll never forget it. I never did.
I'm sure.
So,
Right.
so that was your first case.
That was my first case, and it's on a major case, a school case involving the whole goddamn city.
Yeah.
But it didn't matter. I mean, the racism in the case poured out. They could kill us, you know.
Well, I think it went uphill from there for you, with the cases that you did afterwards.
So anyway, that was my first case with him. So I learned a few things from him on that. One, in the beginning, that he would listen and liked listening and would change if he thought you made sense. And 2, if you screwed up badly, he was going to call you big time. So my next case followed very closely. He sent me out to really prepare a major trial. We didn't have a major trial in Cleveland. We lost on preliminary injunction, and that literally wiped out the case. And so he sent me out there to work with a local Black lawyer, Norris Muldrow, who he and I became very close during the case. And Norris, single practitioner, how he survived, I never quite figured out. So I flew out there, he took me around. I must have gone out there 10 times, back and forth, during the case. And the first time I go out there and he's showing me all this intent. I mean, school, the buses with the white kids are going that way and with the black kids are going that way. I mean, same thing, you know. So first time I'm out there, I said, well, you know, we got to do this. But Bob's only interested in effect. And Norris says to me, I don't give a damn about your Robert Carter. I'm the attorney out here for the school board, and we're going to try the case the way I want to try it. So I went back and I told Bob what Muldrow had said. Oh, God, he was so happy. He said, okay, go back out there and try both ways and let Norris develop all of those intent aspects himself. So actually, judge tried to dismiss the case in the beginning. He said, oh, you're only pleading effect. And Norris said, no, we've got this other case. So judge said, the attorney on the other side, put him in a room and give him whatever files he wants. And he can come out of the room when he's ready. And Norris came out with a solid case on if you were in an 80% black school, you would have no classes in this, no teachers in that, no this and that. If you were in a white school, you had all that shit. And if you were in a 99.9% black school, you had shit.
Mm-hmm.
And so we created this booklet with all the stuff in it, buses going around. And Bob said, I said, Bob, we need experts. And we had no money. I mean, you can't imagine doing this. He said, you can get experts from any of the local colleges and universities as long as you don't pay them. And it's interesting in those times, people were willing to do that. You know, today it's impossible. Yeah. They were willing to do that. So we got 2 experts and they worked their butts off. And we put them both on the stand. They were both good. They had developed terrific evidence. They went through the booklet and showed all this stuff. And then we had one guy from, very well-known guy, a psychologist from a St. Louis University, super guy. And he gave excellent testimony about the effect of all the shit, both the terrible facilities and the scores and everything. And very good testimony. And Norris and I put the whole case on. And then the judge said, well, Judge acted as if he didn't understand what was going on. Oh, we put on one additional piece of evidence, which Bob originally was a little worried about, but as usual, he let me do it. And that was somebody called me up at some point who worked for the City Housing Authority. And he said, black housing's getting torn down, people are moving out, and the school board is carefully looking exactly where they're moving, so they know how to build schools that are going to be 99% black. They know they're segregating with their building program, and they're using their knowledge of where, and they're doing it, they're clearly doing it. And so we got this guy ready to testify. And the judge, of course, said, oh, we're not doing a housing case here. I'm not interested in that, and threw the case out. Sixth Circuit later on said, no problem with that. So we tried this case, but at the after their expert, their superintendent was on. And so Bob said, you guys have done great, but let me cross-examine this. Bob cross-examines him and ends up getting him to say, well, Mr. Bob is saying, look at the test scores, look at the results, look at what happened. The guy said, yes, I understand it's not good, but you've got to consider a lot of factors. And then he said, including heredity. And Bob jumps down his throat and makes him, solidifies that. And the judge then said, well, let's research and I'll consider your motion right now. Bob and I get on a plane and go back. And I had already gotten the deputy superintendent to testify that heterogeneity, whatever,
Heterogeneity.
Was a real plus. So when you put those two things together, come on, give me a break. So I said to Bob, as we're in my usual, this is terrific, we can't lose this, so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. Carter looks at me and he says, come on, Louis, he didn't understand a word we were saying. And then about 2 months later, we get a 25-page opinion. Guy didn't understand the word we were saying. Sixth Circuit upheld the decision. Interestingly enough, we filed a petition for cert, and Thurgood was the only dissenter. Thurgood, whether he was whatever with Carter, he understood. He was the only 8-1. But we spent a ton of time out there. The trial went on for a while, Carter and I, just the closeness, the working together, the caring, brought us very close together,
That sounds like a really, profound experience and case. And yeah, I mean, I was wondering if you were to think about all the cases that you've done, if there's one that you feel, maybe that one that has special significance to you.
Yeah, I mean, I was told that there might be a question on that, so it's not, I'm not totally naive. I know that preparation is important. It's certainly one of the cases I remember all the time. The case that I can't avoid it. It's not a race case, really. It's a sex and national origin case, my Sumitomo case, that I took up to the Supreme Court and won that 9-0 after a split in the circuits. And by the way, you can see the Supreme Court pulling back a little bit on that decision as well. But come on, I love that case, you know, and that started because, and it's one of the things about, one of the delights, I guess, about being a civil rights lawyer, and one of the difficult things at the same time, is cases come out of nowhere. You know, it's it's not like you're working in a big law firm or even a middle-sized firm that's concentrating on something. So one day my niece calls me up, and she's from Jacksonville. And she said, "Cousin Lewis, I'm working for Sue, and they treat me like my job is serving coffee to the yeah. Come over, stay over for maybe 4 or 5 years, work their butts off, go back to Japan." So Joanne says, "Can they do that?" And here I am in my tiny little, well, I said, "No, I'll take that," without looking at what the law was. That case took me probably 3 or 4 years to resolve.
Wow.
But I ended up on the Supreme Court in that case. And by the way, that case teaches you the value of amici briefs, because the Justice Department, the Attorney General, and the Solicitor General pretty much decide how these cases should be handled. And they kept switching back and forth. And so finally I called up either the American Jewish Committee or the American Jewish Congress, one of whom I knew the general counsel, other matters. I called them up and said, "You know, this case is going to be before the Supreme Court, and if it goes the wrong way, that would mean that Saudi Arabia could set up a subsidiary in America and exclude Jews." So I ended up getting an amicus brief from them and an amicus brief from another Jewish organization. And best of all, I got them to call the Solicitor General's office. And, "What are you doing? Why would you do this?" And they switched back to our side. And
So politics by other means.
right, so that worked out pretty well. And then we won, and then I had a lot of excitement in that case. So we won in the Supreme Court, and the lawyer on the other side had been the chief law whatever in the Justice Department on these big cases. So of course Sumitomo hired him, you know, because he was the money man at that point, working for So somehow we end up having this debate between whom and me in the Justice Department auditorium, this huge auditorium. I look out there, there's always people out there. And he's telling me that, yeah, you won in the Supreme Court, but you're never going to get class certification, and you're not, we'll fight you, and so on and so forth. And I answered him, and I said, are you serious? Your subsidiary to Sumitomo is Tora. They want to sell machines to cut the grass. Americans are going to buy that if this really hits the papers. Sumitomo sells this, sells that. Their market is America. You can't do that and survive. And later on, we settled the case. Terrific settlement we made. But I developed a piece of evidence before we settled this, which Kitty loves. In Discovery, they turn over all these books and manuals and whatever in Japanese. Well, it's what we use. Meanwhile, some women in Japan have been reading about the case in Japanese newspaper, sent me an email with this one book in Japanese showing when they wanted to, why they did this, but I'm told they did it often in that type of book. This was a personnel book, and it was about how women should behave in the Japanese office. And the women were, of course, all white with blondine hair, and it was very funny. And they said, you've got to read this, get somebody to help you with it. And when you read it, it told you how to serve tea. And getting on the elevator was very important, you know, how you make sure they get on first, and it goes on and on. So I had this one young woman that somebody put me onto who was born in Japan, came to America, was now an American, and hated the Japanese. And for a very low fee, she became my translator. And she was very smart. And I said to her, look, there's a pile of stuff in Japan. I said, we've got to, and you've got to do it. I can't do it. I can't read a word of Japanese. You've got to work it down to personnel stuff. And so maybe a month or 2 months later, she comes to me with this booklet. And it talks about how you serve tea and how you get on the elevator and how you talk to the Japanese men and all this shit. And I said, okay, that's what I want you to translate. Go translate that for me. So I'm taking the deposition of the head of personnel, Sumitomo, in America, who is, of course, totally fluent in English and obviously Japanese. And I know the attorney on the other side. He knows as little Japanese as I do. So I mark as an exhibit this personnel manual and push it over to him. And I said, have you ever seen this before? Oh, yeah, sure. And this gets sent to you from Japan. Oh, yeah, it's our personnel manual for women. And you use it here in the United States. Yeah, of course we do. Now I want to turn you to page whatever. And I turn to the page and read the most devastating paragraph. I forget what it was. I think it's in the book somewhere. And I said, is that well written? Well, there's problems with that. I said, well, do me a favor, would you? Translate that into correct English that you think absolutely translates that. And thank you very much. And I had no doubt at that point we were going to prevail. I mean, this is our manual, this is what we use, this is whatever. We settled the case, and I ended up, we ended up with a national class. They had offices in 8 cities. And later on, and the class related to all 8 cities. And then later on, I said, I'm going to take a trip. Kitty lived in California. Kitty, we'll go to California. I'll start in LA, work my way up the coast, come on down. And they were furious. They got even angrier when at that point, I finally had an associate. She started calling up Japanese, the women in the office, just come on. My name is blah, 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 and we are class council. Oh, we were treated terribly. We got all this stuff, and they hated it. They made a motion that it was malpractice. We didn't. Miriam was helping me on this. Miriam got all upset because they were accusing her of malpractice. I said, what do you mean? We're class council. We're talking to our class members about how they're treated in these offices. Mm-hmm. So we won that and then settled the case. And by that time, I'd go into Seattle, which I'd never been before. Good city to visit. Seattle, San Francisco, LA. I went to a couple other cities. So some of being a civil rights lawyer is really fun. You know.
So Louis, Alexandra gets to ask the last question.
Oh, wow. Last?
The question around clients.
Okay,
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit about your memorable cases, and later on in your career, you also had the opportunity to work with some individuals and do some really memorable cases there as well. Were there any specific clients? I know you dedicated a few chapters even in your book to some of your clients and their case and their story. Was there any that really stood out to you or has had a lasting impact in whatever way?
I've thought about that a little bit, and certainly one of the clients that comes to mind is John Artis in the Hurricane Carter case. And like other civil rights lawyers who have done high-profile criminal cases and prevailed, often, especially if the client has spent a long time in prison, the client comes out, and the client needs money, and you end up giving the client money. And then the client kind of thinks, it was generally always a he, in these comes back to you for money, and you don't like the relationship. The relationship has changed. It's become a money relationship. And it's kind of painful, you know, it's white, black. And so I've had those experiences and never really quite figured out how you deal with them, how you end them, how you don't end them. They can be painful. And so at one point, well, John was as innocent as any client I can imagine. Being innocent in that hurricane card is impossible. That he could have gone up to people with a gun and blown their head off. John was a very nice, kind man. He was a great athlete, but everyone loved him. So he was in the case because at the time the cops stopped this car, he was driving the car and taking late at night. And so John, we go up to the state Supreme Court, take over the case after they've been in jail 6 years, and win the case. And they get released from jail, from prison. By this time, John has developed something called Berger's disease, which literally causes amputations of your fingers. There's no way to stop it when it's active. And we go to trial. Second time, Myron Beldock and I do. And we talk about it quite a bit in the book. It's what happened in the trial and the racism in the trial, which is astounding. But anyway, we go back and John's back in prison. And Berger's disease is eating him up. And he's in a prison in South Jersey, and there's no doctor in sight in that area that knows a thing about Berger's disease. Handle it. So that's a major problem because the Department of Correction, he's now been convicted again, and they're not gonna drive him up to Newark where the doctor was, and eventually it's probably going to kill him if that doesn't occur. And so it's a complicated little story, but we go up to, I file a motion in northern New Jersey. State court, the whole thing is in state court. And really, my judge, who was a strange man on one level, if he wasn't involved in a case that had so much importance to the criminal system, of which he was intimately involved, was not a bad judge. So if somebody came to him on a bail hearing, he would maybe yell and do this and do that and say, look, you've got to get in a program. I'll help you get in a program. If you don't get a program and you don't do well, I will throw you in jail, blah, blah, blah. But unlike a lot of judges who handle these hearings, he actually tried to be helpful. Now, I hated him because, for the reasons in the book, he was a dyed-in-the-wool racist and conducted a terribly racist trial. But he eventually got the DA to move John up north so he could see the guy. And then he said, you see, Mr. Steele, blah, blah, blah. But then he lectured me about what a fine fellow he was, when he actually was a fine fellow on that issue. And John then gets out of jail again, and the Burgers disease is still going on, and he needs money to get treatment and all that, and he at one point borrows $500 from me. I'm just borrowing this, and I figure he's not. That's happened to me before enough times. I thought the money was gone. And so he gets arrested on something which the charge was correct. He became a runner to raise the money to treat himself. And that's what he needed money for anyway, was buying the drugs or doing whatever he was doing. And so he finally gets the drug, gets out. Oh, we have to go back to they have a trial on the drug charge that they arrest him for while he's out. And he was the low man in that group that were selling drugs. They would say, here, take this and run it to whatever. He was a runner. And eventually gets out. He gets to the point where the Burgers disease is no longer whatever. And he's now out, and when he gets out after spending another year in jail, in which the judge said, I'm putting you in jail for a year because you didn't learn from the first crime you committed. This is after a federal judge had thrown the first crime out. So we get him out. And I say, damn it, why are you still in northern New Jersey? They hate you here. You beat them, you know. I know. So then he goes off. And maybe 3 months later, I get a call. John wants to come over to see me in the office. And he comes over, and he's hooked up to a young woman at that point. They're going to go to Norfolk, Virginia. And they're getting out. And so he hands me an envelope and says, I wanted to give you this envelope. Off in the envelope had $500 in it. And it did, when I think about it, it makes me cry. You know, there's just a few things that make me cry about the cases that I handle. That's one of them. So I remember that, you know. Other examples. I wrote one down. Let me see if I can find it. But that one touched my heart. Maybe I can. I lose so many of them. Well, Norris, I felt very close to him, Norris. He was a lawyer, but he and I worked very closely, and I loved when he said, "God damn, Carter thinks he can," you know, he wasn't going to take that shit, you know. So I really appreciated that he. Oh, I've got a funny Carter experience, which is sort of in the same category. Bob, when he was a senior federal judge, had quite a bit of time off he could take. So he used to go down to Jamaica and rent a house that was up a road. It was great. The house was great. And then somebody must have built on a series of like single rooms that went out. Houses there, swimming pool. And so Kitty and I we went there maybe 3-4 years, something like that. Had great times there. Of course, I'm losing. I've got so many. Well, one thing which is interesting, we go to buy our New York Times. We walk down the hill, and there's cattle on one side and the sheep or whatever. Get to this fancy ass place for tourists, you know, right on the water and all that. Go in there, the two of us. I'm dressed in some raggedy ass shorts, and Carter he had shorts on, but he had Bermuda shorts that were attractive looking, and I'm dressed in my usual schmatas. So we walk down, we get in, and just about to get in, and the black doorman stops him. You know, where are you going? What are you doing? What are you, so on and so forth? And I immediately say, well, we're just going in to get a New York Times. So the guy sees that I'm with Carter, and that's what he sees. And then we come out, and Carter says, "You've been in Jamaica," you know.
Yep.
It really upset him. But the thing I was thinking about, which is a little different, one of Carter's sons, John, who became a state Supreme Court judge, he was married to a really very beautiful woman. He divorced her, now he's remarried to her. We haven't seen them for a while, but we've maintained a relationship. And Bob hated, he was actually everything he dislikes on Sunday. He was the boss there. So very often a little jalopy would go by, and the people in the jalopy would sell T-shirts and all the stuff that they sell you in Jamaica. And Carter didn't want to be bothered by that. They were perfectly nice Jamaicans who came out. They didn't bother you. As a matter of fact, I bought some T-shirts from them. They're nice people. And so I would go, he would yell at his kids for going out. I would go out and buy what I wanted. And his wife just loved that. He let you get away with what he doesn't let anyone else get away with. And it was true. And I knew it, and enjoyed it. But we had a good time in Jamaica with him.
Well, we were gonna have an interview with you for 90 minutes. We have gone way past 2 hours.